my mind is exploding with ideas here, but one of the biggest challenges that I ran into as I was kind of learning this stuff was exactly that. Most of what was happening was below my conscious awareness, and I was just experiencing it as happening to me. And then as I started to get that figured out, and I started to kind of trying to slow down and extend out what was going on and researching it, then I started to realize that the same thing is going on inside of a woman.
Yeah.
And in her case, it's not even the same stuff. It's like, some things are the same, but some are different. And, getting those two things to interact kind of correctly and work correctly when there's only this little surface part that's available really to awareness at any time, it is a fascinating challenge.
Yeah, it's sort of like your idea that attraction is not a choice. For me, what that means is that a woman's conscious awareness, her sort of ability to talk to herself and figure out rationally what is going on in her own brain, is not driving whether she feels certain emotions or attractions. It's the other 99% of the mechanisms that are happening much too quickly for her to track, too unconsciously for her to track, too efficiently in a way for her to track. And her consciousness doesn't even need to know what's going on. Those mechanisms of attraction that, take up most of her brain space are so fluid and efficient that they just do their thing in reaction to the stimuli that males provide. So, physical appearance, movement patterns, nonverbal behavior, conversation. All that stuff is being processed not by a woman's consciousness, but by all these hidden mechanisms that are doing the evaluations for her. And all she'll feel is, after a second or a minute or an hour, is a general sort of sense that I'm attracted to this person or not. That's the outcome of thousands or millions of computations that her brain has been doing during that time, far below the surface of her conscious recognition.
Yeah, as you were talking about the complexity of the brain and the mind, and just kind of our visual perception system. My friends and I have several friends that are interested in this stuff as well, and we sit around and geek out and talk about it a lot. And one of my friends, he and I have this process that we refer to as the indexing process, where and it's just our funny little name for it, where we've both noticed that if a man sees something moving that could possibly be another person walking in his peripheral vision somewhere, he needs to go, kind of go look at it, check it out for a second, see what it is.
Yeah.
And if it happens to be a woman, that he needs to get a front, side, and rear view.
Yeah.
Just a little snapshot. And once those have been completed, it's almost like he can index it and put it in his database for comparison, and then he's now free. But until he's got the views, until he sees what he's dealing with, it's almost like he can't just let it go.
Yeah.
And, a lot of these, we haven't exactly figured them out. I mean, we can, approximate or guess at what we think is going on. But there are so many of these little programs, so to speak, that we have running. And, as men, we can joke about them and, look at a woman and, like you said, see her, body parts or skin or hair or something and make a joke about her being attractive or whatever. But I think the big aha, or one of the big ahas, comes when we start realizing that women have their own set of this stuff, and it can be, in many cases, completely different. It's like the same mechanism, but it's based on a whole different set of parameters, and it's running in a different sequence, and it's sorting for different things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is what makes it so hard for the sexes to understand each other, is to recognize that the cues, the features that we look for immediately, that we process immediately when we meet somebody new, are really different. Of course, women recognize which guys are physically attractive, but mostly they're processing information about the guy's status, self-confidence, and personality. And that's really what they're tuned into. Where does he stack up in the local social hierarchy? And would he make a good dad Is he a psychopath who might rape or beat me? They're making all these assessments because, guys, if you imagine your sisters going out and meeting men, think, what would you want them to notice about guys to be safe? Those are exactly the things that women are built to notice about guys through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. Because the women who didn't notice those things did not survive and reproduce as effectively.
Okay, so, moving further forward in the story of evolutionary psychology and mating, what are some of the things that the later thinkers kind of figured out and that kind of led to some of your own realizations?
I guess one of the central figures was Richard Dawkins, the British biologist. He really brought together a lot of the themes that were happening in evolutionary biology in the 1970s with his book, The Selfish Gene. And for me, what The Selfish Gene represents is a realization that bodies are transient. Bodies come and go, but genes are forever. As sort of the owners of bodies, as brains that are thinking, we tend to think, well, the human body that we're in is the be-all and end-all of evolution. It's the focal point. It's the unit of function, the unit of selection, the unit of operation. Dawkins' great insight was to say, no, bodies are here because genes want them to be, because genes grow them to simply replicate the genes better. And that insight really led to a revival of what's called sexual selection theory, which is biologists studying how animals are attracted to each other, how they mate, how they advertise their fitness and health to each other to attract mates. Because they realized, look, if you're a little set of genes and you grow a body that survives well but doesn't attract mates, that body is a dead end. It's an evolutionary dead end. Those genes will go nowhere. So it can pay often for animals and humans to invest a whole lot of time and energy growing sexual ornaments and courtship abilities that are very costly and difficult and complex, that might even reduce survival abilities, but that increase mating opportunities. So I think there's almost a direct line from Dawkins into the revival of this sexual selection theory in the 80s and 90s, where biologists started to ask, what good is the peacock's tail? What good are the elk's antlers? Why do they grow these ridiculous things? And they realized, well, from a gene's point of view, the peacock's tail is even more practical than the peacock's beak or legs or wings, because it's something that will directly help replicate those peacock genes. They will attract the peahen, and she will have pea chicks, and the genes for amazing tails will spread. And in fact, the peacock's beak, brain, body, feet, wings are really only useful to the extent that they help the tail to grow. And that was a sort of big aha moment for me, that survival's only useful in as much as it helps increase mating opportunities. So when you look at, let's say, young men taking ridiculous risks, snowboarding or base jumping or skydiving or joining up with, the Navy SEALs, on the surface that looks irrational, because you think, God, they're, dramatically decreasing their survival opportunities. But then I thought, well, that's just standard operating procedure for all male animals. Decrease survival if it will increase your mating opportunities. If it increases your status and attractiveness, it's worth it. So that was just a kind of huge perspective shift that I really enjoyed developing throughout the 90s, that we are living, breathing sexual ornaments first, and survival machines only second.
Kind of sheds a new light on, when the rock stars say, live fast, die young, and leave a good-looking corpse.
Yeah, absolutely. They get this intuitively. And it's partly because they've thrown off the shackles of the sort of cultural programming that they've been given that says, be patient, educate yourself, get a stable job, you'll be able to enjoy life when you retire in 50 years. They've thrown that off, and they've said, no, we've got a deep evolutionary wisdom that's telling us there's a different way to live that is actually more in tune with human nature.
So I almost feel like this conversation is, the beginning of a James Bond movie where we just did the introduction. And now we can almost start talking about the story, which is, can you explain your concept of the mating mind? Because I feel like we've just laid the foundation for what that is, and maybe just talk about the mating mind, your theories, how you maybe put them together, and maybe a couple of just the most important ahas you had that led to the theory.
Sure. I guess I started out by looking at all the different ridiculous traits and ornaments and bodily appendages that different animal species grow to attract mates. So elks grow antlers, peacocks grow tails, stalk-eyed flies grow their eyes on the end of long eye stalks that make it really hard to fly, but that the females find really attractive for some reason. Almost every species you look at, the males are doing something sort of absurd and ridiculous and colorful and costly to attract females. In most cases, they're growing a body ornament, a bunch of feathers or horns or something that's sort of conspicuous to females in a fairly simple way. But I thought humans are different. Humans have a few body ornaments like that. Women have breasts, men have beards, men have long, thick penises compared to other primates. Men are tall and have a lot of body muscles in the upper body. So those are kind of like standard animal ornaments, sexual ornaments. But I thought the real ornament humans have is the mind. It's what we do with our brains. The ability to talk, to make jokes, to make art, to make music. And those are really the most important sexual ornaments that humans have, I thought. Mm-hmm. We might feel lust for other people's bodies. So you might see a woman and in a few seconds think, she'd be fun as a short-term mate, as a one-night stand. But that's not enough to fall in love with a woman and commit to a woman. We only do that when we hold her brain, her mind, her personality in some degree of esteem and think, this is, potential life partner, soulmate, whatever. So I thought the brain's the most important sexual ornament that humans have. And that holds for both sexes, males and females. We fall in love with each other's minds and personalities. And those are manifest through certain kinds of behaviors more than others. They're manifest mostly through talking. We talk each other to death compared to any other species. They're also manifest through things like dance, music, art, humor, ideologies. And I thought, well, instead of seeing the human brain as a survival machine, maybe it's more useful in certain ways to think of it as a sexual ornament that's there to be attractive to the other sex and to sort of show off how well our genes work and how well our bodies work, how well our brains work. And that's the basic idea in the mating mind.
That's fascinating because it's looking at something from the other perspective, the one that no one would ever think of. It reminds me of, I was reading one of Brad Blanton's books, and he said, we used to swim around in the ocean and, have gills that, ran through the water and sucked the oxygen out. Well, now we've taken the ocean and we put it inside of ourselves.
Yeah.
And it circulates around our lungs, and we pull the air in, and we do it the other way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, it's like just seeing it, that little shift, and saying, hey, wait, maybe we're really smart not because it helps us survive better, but because it helps us mate better.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And these are the shifts that I think are really helpful because it just increases your sort of intellectual weaponry, your ways of being able to view the world, even if you don't completely buy the idea. It's just another little perspective that can shed light on certain aspects of human nature and certain aspects of relationships.
So, one of the other things you said that was might be interesting to just touch on for a second is that there actually is a conflict that exists sometimes between survival and mating.
Yeah, you've got trade-offs always in biology, trade-offs between sort of how fast you grow and how long you live, trade-offs between the number of offspring you have and how much you can take care of each offspring. And you've also got a trade-off between survival and reproduction. Now, it would be easy if evolution wanted to make us live for 1,000 years and have one or two kids each and play it very safe, stay up in trees, avoid leopards, avoid starvation, take no risks. Evolution could have produced a species like that. But it didn't, because it paid more to live relatively fast and die relatively young and leave a lot of babies. Now, compared to other primates, we live a long time and we reproduce fairly slowly. But I'm just pointing out, compared to something like a sequoia or an oak tree, we live pretty fast and die pretty young. So evolution's decided, given the way we live, the way we make a living, the way we find food and avoid predators, the kind of habitats we lived in, it was better to, grow, hit puberty at 13, have babies by 20, and live no more than probably 60 years under prehistoric conditions.
I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on, the differences between living now and living, say, 50,000 years ago, and what that really means to an average guy who's trying to use understanding himself better to be more successful with the opposite sex.
Yeah. I think for me, the key difference in the sort of mating and dating realm is just the number of people around. In prehistory, when we lived in little bands called hunter-gatherer groups, they're called that because the men hunted, the women gathered fruits and vegetables, and that's how they ate. Those little bands were maybe 20 or 30 people, half of which would have been your blood relatives. They wouldn't have been potential mates because that would be incest and you'd have messed up children. So the number of potential mates available who you'd meet in a lifetime would have been very limited. If anybody new wanders into your area, they would attract a lot of attention prehistorically. Amazing, a new person. God, we haven't seen a new person in 13 months, right? Mm. And so they would attract a huge amount of interest. They would be salient. You'd get the roving eye effect where you would just have to look at them. You couldn't help it. They're new and different. They might present a wonderful opportunity. They might present a lethal threat. You don't know. You've got to check them out. In modern cities of 10 million, 20 million, you're meeting new people sort of one per second as you walk down the street. And this is overwhelming for a kind of primate brain like ours that's used to trying to check out everything it possibly can about every new person it sees. So I think one effect of that is we're sort of puzzled by our own roving eyes and our interest in novelty. But this makes perfect sense if you think prehistorically novelty was rare. We didn't meet that many new people. A second effect of living in small groups is that because the number of potential mates is very, very limited, you really want to pursue any particular prospect sort of avidly and for as long as possible and see if it works. So you develop crushes, infatuations, fall in lust, fall in love, pursue somebody to the exclusion of others for quite a while before you give up. And that made sense prehistorically. But now it doesn't make sense. It's completely irrational. There's so many prospects out there now that to prematurely commit your time and energy to pursuing any one of them doesn't make much rational sense. It's just a holdover from prehistoric times when there just weren't that many people of the other sex around. Mm. And both men and women suffer from this sort of mismatch now between their emotions, which are telling them, if somebody's even slightly interesting and attractive, go for them, obsess about them, get infatuated with them, versus the rational approach, which would be just meet a lot of people choose carefully, hang back, take your time. We're not wired that way. It's very, very hard for us to do that. So we're not well adapted to big city life in that sense.
Another thing, during the conversation when you and I first met, and we were sitting in the coffee shop, we were talking about social status and so forth, and you were mentioning that kind of in the old days, we got a lot more feedback and consistent cues about where we stood in the group and how that is different today.
Yeah, absolutely. So also, a third effect of living in these small hunter-gatherer bands in prehistory is you know everybody and everybody knows you. They've had years of experience watching you and assessing you and learning your personality. And they know exactly how bright you are, whether you're conscientious, whether you've got a hair-trigger temper, whether you're a good hunter, whether you're a good parent. They know everything about you, and they know what your general social status is, whether you're basically, a plus to the group or a minus. And probably if you're a minus, you would have been killed or ostracized long ago anyway. So anybody in your group, you'd probably have a certain amount of respect for, and they'd have a certain amount of respect for you, and you'd sort of know where you stood in the pecking order. But in modern society, we have these fragmented lives where we meet completely different sets of people in our homes versus school versus work versus Starbucks versus driving on the freeway. Most of them we don't know, they don't know us, and they don't know anything about us. So we get this status ambiguity that we're constantly getting social cues and feedback from people who feel like, I don't know who you are. I don't know whether you're good or bad, what status you have, whether I should respect you or not. And that's a very uncomfortable position for us to be in, because we like to be secure about where we are in the social hierarchy. That gives a sense of comfort and stability. In other social primate groups like chimpanzees or gorillas, if somebody doesn't know where they are in the hierarchy, what that means is that the group is in chaos. It means the alpha male, the dominant male, has just died or been cast out. There's probably a power struggle going on. A lot of the babies are being killed. A lot of the females are being raped. A lot of the males are getting caught up in fights. And so basically status ambiguity is a cue that you're in a really bad, stressful, dangerous situation. But that's the impression we get from modern life all the time. We don't know where we are in terms of our status. People don't recognize us. And I think that causes a lot of stress and uncertainty.
Yeah, and then you pile on top of that the quote-unquote corporate machine and, the programming that comes from that, which teaches you to be insecure even more if you don't know where you stand, or if you're not one of the in-group, or you're not purchasing their product to be one of the in-group. Probably
yeah, absolutely.
Compounds that.
Yeah, in hunter-gatherers societies, you don't get fired arbitrarily for no reason. Maybe if you've been a real nasty bully for years, the group might eventually decide, you need to be ostracized, we're going to get rid of you, leave. But you don't suddenly have a manager coming along and saying, sorry, we've got to downsize you even though you're a good worker. That just wouldn't happen prehistorically. Or likewise, you wouldn't have these fad and fashion cycles where, oh, you've got a Lexus, but Audi is cool this year. And so suddenly your status is diminished just because the fashion cycle has shifted under your feet.
This really explains, I think, a lot of the difficult and complex emotional and psychological responses that men have when they run into challenges meeting women. If you go talk to a woman and she isn't interested in you, logically, you should just walk away and go, oh, that one wasn't interested, let's go talk to another one. Whereas, as a human male in today's society, sometimes we walk away and start thinking, oh, that must mean all these things about me. She doesn't like me, that means other women probably don't like me. And you get all these irrational fantasies that come up and so forth. And kind of just that little paradigm or that little explanation I think in a lot of ways helps understand, why we might have these responses.
Yeah, that whole sense of anxiety and intimidation and nervousness before going up and talking to a woman. You can understand why that's there if you think about prehistoric social groups. Yes, if you'd gone up to one woman in your hunter-gatherer band and you'd made a play for her, come on to her, A, everybody would be watching it. B, if you get rejected, everybody would make fun of you for the next several weeks. C, even everybody who wasn't there would gossip about it for weeks. And so there would be real social costs to failure. But in modern life, there aren't any of those costs, really. If you're in a sort of anonymous nightclub or bar or public library, whatever, and you go up to somebody and try to talk to them and they're not interested, nobody cares. Nobody's paying attention. They don't know you. They don't know her. They're not going to gossip about it. You don't really suffer any loss of face rationally. But we're still carrying around these emotions that act as if it matters. That act as if, oh, we somehow are losing face if we fail in that approach. And I think if you just bear in mind where those emotions come from, it can really help to sort of, recognize them and say, okay, I'm having that emotion, but I'm not going to identify with it. I'm going to put it aside. I'm going to keep it at arm's length. I'm not going to let it rule my life. And I think that's where it really helps to recognize these mismatches between modern life and prehistoric life.
Hi again, it's David D'Angelo. Welcome to another edition of my interviews with dating gurus. Today I'm having a conversation with a gentleman who goes by the name of Jeffrey Miller, and he's the author of a book called The Mating Mind. And what makes Mr. Miller so special in this world of success with women and dating is that he's kind of spent his career studying what's called evolutionary psychology, and specifically as it applies to the interactions between men and women. And he's developed some interesting theories that I think that you're going to find very interesting. What makes Jeffrey Miller, really extra special is that in my own search, as I was learning about how to be more successful with women and dating, I read a lot of books. I read a ton of books, in fact. And I read a lot of books on psychology and behavior and mating. And there were a few real gems that stood out that you hear me talking about. And his book, The Mating Mind, is one of those. It's probably the book that I mention the most when it comes to, really getting a behind-the-scenes perspective of how these, different forces that evolved in the human mind shape and affect our behavior and our interactions with each other. So this is definitely one of the most exciting interviews that I've, ever gotten ready for, and I'm very interested to see how this goes. So I'd like to welcome you, Jeffrey.
Thanks, David. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. Maybe, just as a little bit of an introduction, you could talk about yourself, maybe who you are as a person, and how you got interested in this particular area, and then maybe, just tell a little story about some of the things that you learned along the way and how that came to you writing a book.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. Pretty ordinary background. Went off to Columbia University in New York. And I had the usual college fun and frustrations with trying to meet women, trying to understand them, having a series of relationships that lasted different amounts of time, dramatically different amounts of time, and thinking, this is a real challenge. Understanding women, understanding my own motivations and preferences is one of the big challenges. It makes high school calculus look easy. And I really got into psychology at that point in college because I wanted to understand human nature and particularly the sexes. So after Columbia, I went on to Stanford to do my PhD in psychology. And I started out being interested in some of the more abstract topics in psychology, like cognition and memory and reasoning and judgment. But I realized those topics were pretty dry, and I couldn't stand thinking of spending a 40-year career researching those sorts of things. I wanted something a little juicier, more interesting, a little bit closer to real human life. So I eventually found some people who were just starting to do something called evolutionary psychology, who were hanging around Stanford at that time. And they took the view that humans are animals, humans evolved, our brains are there for a purpose. Our brains are there to help our bodies survive and our genes to reproduce. And it really helps a lot if you want to understand human emotions and motivations and preferences and how people interact, to keep in mind that everything we do has been shaped by those two sort of functional goals, survival and reproduction. And as soon as I read a lot of stuff about that, from biology and psychology and anthropology, I realized this was a really powerful tool for gaining insight into relations between the sexes. And that really launched me into this, so far, 15-year career of trying to understand human sexuality and psychology by thinking about how did our ancestors feel attraction to each other? How did they fall in love? How did they fall in lust? How did they make babies? How did they discriminate between mates they wanted and mates they didn't want? And that's really been the theme of my research ever since.
Mm. Now, one of the things you said there was that at one point you got interested in things like cognition and, I think you said memory and perception, or these kind of more abstract things. And it seems to me that men, especially, who seem to be a little bit more in their head, and especially when you're talking about logical, intelligent guys, they try to reason through the problems that they have in their interactions with women.
Yeah, that's right.
And, if you grow up as a man and you learn all your life that you can reason through most of your challenges, and then you run into this one, which is like the most frustrating, and you find that your tools of reasoning and logic don't seem to work here in this domain, that can be a big challenge. As you were learning about the mating process, let's just call it, did you find some areas where there was a conflict between, let's just call it, common logic and the reality of what was going on?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's not that I think there's anything wrong with logic and reasoning per se. It's just that those are very limited tools that are only as good as the sort of world model, the mental model you've got of the situation that you're in. If you start with the wrong assumptions, logic will lead you very far astray. Mm-hmm. And what I realized was I had the wrong assumptions about men and women and dating and mating and reproduction. Everything I'd absorbed from American popular culture about the way things should be in relationships and in dating was very misleading. And this is what leads men to frustration, indignation, resentment, that there's a huge mismatch between what they were taught and the way things actually work. So I realized that the great leverage you get from evolutionary psychology is you can think about how did things actually work for our ancestors 100,000 years ago or 1,000,000 years ago. What problems did they face? And how similar are those to the problems we face now? As soon as I got that new perspective, I was able to dump a lot of the cultural baggage that I'd picked up as a kid, as a teenager, from TV, radio, magazines, etc. And I could think a lot more clearly, I found. The other problem is logic and reasoning is not very good when you're trying to do empathy, when you're trying to do perspective taking, when you're trying to get in the heads of other people. Mm-hmm. There you've got to have a leap of imagination. If you want to understand women or other men, sexual rivals who are going after the same women, you can't do that leap of imagination through logic. You've got to really try to sort of will yourself into their skins, into their shoes, think about how things are from their point of view. And guys are not typically well equipped through schooling or parenting to make those kind of empathetic leaps very well. So we're left baffled. We don't understand how other people think and feel, and that makes it hard to get along socially.
Yeah, one of the things that, I have these ahas every once in a while as I really try to figure this area out. And one of the ones that almost made me just like laugh out loud and still makes me shake my head and smile every time I think about it is this idea that a lot of guys who are, again, intellectual types or maybe have, strong kind of mental powers, very logical, they can't stand this idea of learning from someone that's not as smart as them.
Yeah.
And they look around, and the guys that they see succeeding with women or just plain aren't as smart as them. And so they look at it as like, well, I'd have to stoop if I would learn from someone like that.
Yeah. Exactly.
Whereas, that less intelligent guy who just gets how to meet women, it just comes to him. And he's not sitting there thinking about it or analyzing it. He just gets it.
Yeah, I tend to think of wisdom as the ability to learn from people less intelligent than you, but who know more than you about a particular domain. If you want to learn tennis, you don't go and pick the highest IQ tennis coach necessarily. You pick the best tennis coach. And they might be bright, they might not be bright, they might have a PhD, they might not. But you've got to have the self-realization to know there are many, many different ways to be good at things in life. And approaching them intellectually, rationally, based on book learning is only one way to pick up knowledge. For somebody like me who's always been good at school, good at academics, that's a threatening thing to contemplate because it's a threat to our self-esteem. We have to recognize that, okay, the ability to do whatever, computer programming or write books or do well in classes is not the be-all and end-all of human achievement. And in particular, if we allocate our time to doing that stuff, if we're the ones who are studying 60 hours a week all through our 20s, those are 60 hours that we're not out there talking to women and men and not gaining social skills and not learning how to manage conflict or all those other crucial things that have to do with building self-esteem and social skills.
It's a great point. Maybe could you explain just the ideas of, basic evolution and basic psychology, and then how they're now coming together over the last, especially few decades?
Sure. Evolution really is just the idea that whatever works, whatever works ends up persisting. When it comes to things that work, we're talking about little units of DNA called genes. The genes that grow bodies and brains, that work, that survive and reproduce, tend to leave more copies of themselves. So those genes increase in number. The genes that don't work, that produce stupid brains, bodies that die too early, immune systems that cannot fight off bacteria and viruses, those genes die out, go extinct. And so evolution is just one long process of differential reproduction. Some genes reproduce, some don't. And all the species on Earth, all the biodiversity, the 20 million species that inhabit the Earth, are just an outcome of that process. It's not a random process. The mutations that shape genes might be random, but who survives and who reproduces is very much not random. So there's this huge storehouse of genetic wisdom in our bodies, in every cell in our bodies. 3 billion base pairs of DNA, 20 or 30,000 genes. And they've been shaped over millions and millions of years to do well, to grow bodies and brains that are not necessarily good at, let's say, learning calculus or making money in a modern economy, but that are good at noticing dangers, noticing social threats, noticing reproductive opportunities, being motivated to pursue status and mates, and keeping our children healthy. And that's the stuff most people are pretty good at. And evolutionary psychology is just a process of studying all those brain systems, those mental traits, preferences and abilities that are in our heads that help us survive and reproduce effectively.
Now, I tend to, I honor different perspectives of just everything, because I've gone through a lot of different stages in my life, and I kind of tend to approach this with the idea that no one was around in the past that's around today, and we don't really know what happened, but that this is a very useful model regardless of what your view is of how, the universe came into being or what have you. And it's becoming more and more obvious to more and more, let's just call it segments of, people and groups, that this process has taken place, and it's becoming more and more integrated and accepted into our culture and our society. And so, and I just find that studying the basic evolution of just about anything that you're interested in, whether it be, music or knowledge or art or whatever it is, can be very enlightening.
Yeah, I think that's right. You can have any religious or political or ideological sort of worldview that you want, and you don't have to buy into the whole Darwinian theory. It's almost enough just to think functionally. That is, to think, what are our bodies for? What's the heart for? What are eyeballs and ears for? What functions do they serve? And then you can think about human emotions or preferences about sexual partners in the same way. You can ask, why are we attracted to women who have beautiful skin or glossy hair or big symmetric breasts or narrow waists and broader hips? Wherever those functional mechanisms come from, wherever those preferences come from, it could be God, it could be evolution, it really helps to think about these sort of why questions. Why do we have those preferences? Why do women want guys who are cocky, funny, who are witty, entertaining, who are self-confident? You can always dig underneath the apparent dynamics of social interaction and ask, what's really going on here? What are the functions of these behaviors? And really, that's 90% of evolutionary psychology. Darwin himself, the sort of historical perspective of evolution, is sort of 10%.
And then what about on the psychology side? I know that this sounds like a stupid question, but what is psychology, and how did you get interested in it? What are some of the big ahas you had? And then maybe you could tie it into evolution and talk about how they connected to each other.
I think for me, psychology is just the study of human nature. There are other kinds of psychologists, like primate psychologists, who might study other kinds of natures, like chimpanzee nature or gorilla nature. Every species has its nature, which is its set of behaviors and abilities and preferences, emotions and motivations that drive what they do. And human psychology is just trying to figure out, what's the structure of human nature? Why do we have the emotions that we do? Why do we have the styles of interaction that we do? And so I think that's fundamental to understanding almost everything that goes on in society, all the way from politics through marketing, whether your computer software is going to be easy to use or hard to use, whether your art or music is going to be attractive or not to people. And I got interested in human nature basically because I found it baffling. I found it really complex, really peculiar, and really unpredictable. I thought, out of all the things you could study in the universe, stars, atoms, molecules, the human brain really is the most complex system that we've discovered so far. It's the hardest to comprehend. It's sort of the pinnacle of complexity in the world so far that we've found. And that's why I thought it was sort of a worthy scientific challenge and something I'd be happy spending my life trying to understand.
And of course, the irony is that we get to carry around one of these between our ears, all of us individually, our whole life.
Yeah, and that's both a blessing and a curse to a psychologist, the fact that we're in a brain. You can think about things from the inside, but we're only aware of, a tiny proportion of what actually goes on in our minds. Most of what goes on happens far too quickly for us to track. If you see a woman and you feel a sense of attraction to her, that'll typically happen within about half a second or a second. You'll do a visual assessment, face, body, what do I think of that? Now, in that second, there are thousands of things going on in the brain, thousands of judgments and inferences and perceptions happening. And they're completely unconscious. We're not aware of them. We can't figure out what our brains are doing in that second. So we have the illusion that it's simple. It's not at all simple. We can't build a computer system that can do anywhere close to human visual abilities. So the human mind is kind of like an iceberg where only sort of the top 1% shows to ourselves. And when I try to understand human mating and relations between the sexes, I try to keep that in mind all the time, that women don't know why they do the things they do, men don't know why they do the things they do, and most relationships are largely baffling to both people from start to finish. So I think that's where sort of developing a better understanding of human nature can really help people to sort of understand what's happening in the 99% of my brain that I don't have conscious access to, that I can't just figure out on my own without science, without psychologists helping to sort of inform me about what's really going on in myself.
Yeah, and that's also, it's just so. Can you maybe put some light on, maybe tell a little bit of a story maybe about some of the different thinkers that started fusing, evolutionary psychology together, and it's kind of hip to talk about how stupid Freud was, or Jung, or some of these people that I consider to be brilliant people. And, now you look at some of the things that they said. I mean, even today, a lot of the things that these guys figured out, I think, is very profound. But you look at some of it and you go, well, they were wrong here, or they didn't get this. But in a lot of ways, they cracked open this, this whole world, again, that just has changed the whole direction of how we think and, what we're doing to figure ourselves out. And I just find it fascinating that all of these different sciences are starting to merge together. And maybe you can introduce some of the thinkers like Dawkins and some of the others, and just tell a little bit of a story.
Well, for me, I guess the key figures way back in the 19th century were Darwin himself, of course, but also Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, and also Thorstein Veblen, the American economist. I think what those three guys had in common was a recognition that organic life is about self-interest and survival and reproduction. Nietzsche understood that, in a very deep way, I think, that everything we think and feel is to some degree self-deceptive, that we think we're reasoning objectively about situations when in fact we're reasoning in a very self-interested way. We're reasoning in ways that basically take advantage of others, that increase our social status, that increase our mating opportunities. That was really Nietzsche's basic idea in The Will to Power, which is a frequently misunderstood idea. The will to power does not mean the will to fascism. It just points out individuals are highly self-deceptive in their reasoning, and they do a lot of things that might not even make sense to themselves. For example, women being attracted to bad boys. Motorcycle gang members when their parents say you should meet a nice dentist. Nietzsche understood that kind of thing. Veblen also understood that when people buy costly luxuries, they're showing off. They're not buying them because those things give them pleasure. They're buying them for prestige and status so that they increase their control and power and attractiveness over others. So I think Darwin, Nietzsche, Veblen are important figures, and I always go back to them whenever I'm stuck thinking about an issue, and they're just storehouses of wonderful insights. And then Freud kind of cracked open the whole idea of the unconscious, that basically this idea that 99% of what goes on in our brains is unconscious. We don't have access to it. If we did, we'd be appalled. We couldn't show our faces in public. And he recognized that sexuality is absolutely central to human nature. And I think that's his one great insight. That a lot of things that look like they're there for survival or status or friendship or, even things like wanting a good job, wanting to make money. That's not the real reason why we want those things. The real reason ultimately boils down to sexual success and mating often. So Freud kind of didn't give Darwin credit for the number of ideas that Freud borrowed from Darwin, but he at least put sexuality on the table and said, here, look at this. And we basically spent most of the 20th century, coping with that. How can we publicly acknowledge human sexuality in a way that doesn't result in civilization falling apart? That's what happened with, the Kinsey reports, the sexual revolution in the 60s, the rise of feminism. All of that was about the recognition of sexuality as being central to human nature. And we're still trying to sort out those pieces.
Yeah, it's so driven, so, deep down, just so repressed by almost these cultural or religious systems in so many ways that it's hard to imagine it ever getting what you might think of as fully integrated in a healthy way, because we're so, we've become so, I think anyway, dysfunctional in a complex way because of the way the different groups and the different views and kind of the social worldviews interact with each other. Like I said, it just seems hard to imagine that it will ever kind of get fully worked out. Where do you think it's going?
Yeah, I think this is something to bear in mind, that and this is one of Nietzsche's great points, by the way, that every ideology, every belief system has an agenda. Everybody who spouts a particular worldview has some kind of agenda, often that's self-interested or for the good of their family or their group or their particular way of trying to attract people. What I mean by that, for example, is if you have a bunch of people running around saying monogamy is great, everybody should wait till they get married to have sex, and then they should only have sex in marriage, and they should only have penile vaginal sex, and that's it. These people have a particular agenda in terms of the way they'd like society to be organized, because they feel that they as individuals or families could prosper and do well under that arrangement. The people who run around and say free love is great, sexual promiscuity is great, have a different agenda. And it's partly because they feel like they're the kind of people who could prosper under those conditions. So I think it's important to bear in mind that every sort of ideological battle that happens at the cultural level is basically a battle about mating strategies at the individual level. You can see this in the history of attitudes towards prostitution, for example. In the 19th century, as prostitution was rampant throughout the American West, with the miners and ranchers needing sexual outlets, less reputable women came along first, and then more reputable women came along later and said prostitution's bad. And what you can see basically is there was a conspiracy between high-status, intelligent women and low-status men to outlaw prostitution. Why? Because the high-status women wanted to keep their rich men from wandering away to prostitutes, and the low-status men who couldn't afford prostitutes didn't want the women they could marry taken away and becoming a consort of rich men. By contrast, lower-class women and rich men supported prostitution because they could benefit from it. And so what you've got there in a little microcosm, a little tiny example, is the way that people's individual mating strategies shape their social and political attitudes. And I think that's what's playing out right now in America. I don't know if that made much sense. But...
Yeah, that was fantastic. And the scientific term I use for insights like that is a freak show, because it is.
Yeah.
The thing that came to me there as you were talking was that we also, humans are individually complex. They can have conflicting views, and you can have for instance, let's call it a rich, high-status woman who's very conservative, But secretly, she might have an identity where she is a low status prostitute.
Yeah.
And she might enjoy that fantasy, but she would never tell anyone that publicly.
Yeah, absolutely. We might adopt only one mating strategy in public, but in our sexual imagination, almost everybody adopts every possible one in every combination, in our dreams and our fantasies, etc. And so that's why people can be threatened by other mating strategies, because they've already been there in their imaginations, and they know how it would go. So the wives of the rich men understand the prostitutes because they've been there already in their sexual fantasies. And likewise, Silicon Valley engineers can understand the threat posed by the bad boy, the motorcycle gang guy, because they've already been there in their sexual imagination.